Allis-Chalmers once employed 15,000 people on 160 acres of factory floor in West Allis, Wisconsin, building everything from farm tractors to hydroelectric turbines. Today, the plant is gone, replaced by retail parks, light industrial tenants, and parking lots where foundries used to pour molten iron. The smell of Persian orange paint that hung in the assembly building for decades has no surface left to cling to. Then, the decisions began. Executives rigged bids in the electrical price-fixing scandal. The board gave Fiat a 65% stake in the construction equipment division. Siemens took control of the electrical business. Simplicity was sold off. Leadership turned over from David Scott to Wendell Blake as crisis management replaced strategy. And when the farm economy collapsed, Retzrar. The board sold the tractor division, the only part of the company ordinary Americans had ever loved, to a German firm most farmers had never heard of. On December 6, 1985, the last orange tractor rolled off the West Allis line at 10:26 in the morning. Workers lined the floor and photographed it. The conveyors stopped, and they never started again. This is the story of Edward Allis, a leather dealer who bought a bankrupt ironworks in 1860 and built it into an empire that gave a city its name, and how the men who inherited that empire dismantled it, decision by decision, until the orange was gone and the silence was all that was left. We tell the stories behind the industries that shape the everyday world. If that's your thing, subscribe. More of these are coming. Now, let's get back to the story. West Allis, Wisconsin, December 6th, 1985. The last Allis-Chalmers tractor rolled off the line at 10:26 in the morning. Model 6070. Orange, like everyone before it. Workers lined the assembly floor and watched it come through. Some of them had been building tractors in this plant for 30 years. A few took photographs. Most just stood there. Nobody rushed. Nobody shouted. The line stopped, and the sound that had filled this building since before most of them were born simply wasn't there anymore. One worker told the Milwaukee Sentinel he felt like he was watching a funeral. Another said he didn't know what he was supposed to do with his hands. The foreman signed off the production ticket. The overhead conveyors went still. And a tractor company that had once put its orange machines on more American farms than almost anyone, except John Deere and International Harvester, was finished building tractors forever. The plant didn't explode, it didn't burn, it just went quiet. And that quiet would spread. Within 2 years, Allis-Chalmers would file for bankruptcy. Within 14 years, the last office in the Milwaukee area would close, and the company's presence in the city it had literally helped name would be nothing but concrete, memory, and a few thousand former employees who still called themselves Allis people. But that ending, the bankruptcy, the erasure, the long administrative death, is not where this story starts. This story starts 125 years earlier, with a man who bought a dead factory and decided it wasn't dead yet. Milwaukee, 1860. Edward P. Allis was not a manufacturer. He was a leather dealer from New York who had come west looking for opportunity and found a bankrupt ironworks called the Reliance Works, sitting idle on the south side of Milwaukee. The equipment was outdated. The debts were ugly. The previous owners had failed completely. Most people in the city considered the place finished. Allis bought it anyway. He was in his late 30s, married, with children. He had no engineering background. He had never run a foundry. He had never cast iron or built a steam engine or managed a shop floor full of men who worked with molten metal. What he had was a businessman's instinct for value and wreckage and a stubbornness that the people around him would either admire or curse, depending on how things turned out. The Reliance Works, in 1860, was not a promising investment by any rational measure. Milwaukee was growing, yes, and the Civil War was about to create enormous demand for iron and machinery, but Allis didn't know that yet. What he knew was that the building was there, the equipment was there, and the men who knew how to run it were still in Milwaukee looking for work. He saw a gap between what the place was and what it could be, and he walked into it. He reopened the works. He started small: millstones, sawmill equipment, flour milling machinery. Wisconsin was wheat country and Minnesota was coming up fast, and every mill that processed grain needed equipment that someone had to build. Allis positioned himself not as an inventor, but as a supplier. He would build what the region needed, build it solidly, and build it on time. It was not glamorous. There was no signature product in those early years, no breakthrough machine that put his name in newspapers. He was a regional ironworks owner in a growing Midwestern city, competing with dozens of other small foundries for the same contracts. But he had two qualities that would matter enormously over the next 2 decades. First, he hired well. Allis had the sense to find men who knew more than he did about machinery and let them do their work. He built a team of engineers and foremen who understood metallurgy, casting, and the specific demands of milling equipment. He didn't pretend to be a technical genius. He was the man who kept the shop open, found the customers, managed the money, and made sure the right people were in the right jobs. Second, he expanded carefully but relentlessly. When flour milling technology shifted from millstones to steel rollers in the 1870s, Allis didn't resist the change. He retooled. When the market for sawmill equipment grew, he added capacity. When he saw an opportunity to build steam engines and pumping equipment, he went after it. Each step was deliberate. Each one made the works a little larger, a little more capable, a little harder to ignore. By the mid-1870s, the Reliance Works had become the Edward P. Allis Company, and it was no longer a small foundry. It was one of Milwaukee's significant industrial operations, employing hundreds of men and producing heavy machinery that shipped across the Midwest. The man who had bought a bankrupt works with no engineering experience had built something real. But Allis wasn't building a tractor company. He wasn't building a brand that farmers would recognize by color. He was building an industrial machinery business, and he was building it in a city that was itself being built by people exactly like him, men who had come from somewhere else, seen opportunity in the raw industrial Midwest, and decided to stay. What made Allis different from the dozens of other foundry owners in Milwaukee was not genius. It was duration. He kept going. He kept the works open through recessions, through labor disputes, through technological shifts that killed competitors who couldn't adapt. He outlasted people. And when he died in 1889, he left behind a company that employed roughly 1,500 workers and had a reputation across the milling and mining industries as a builder of serious, reliable equipment, not the biggest company in America, not the most famous, but real, rooted, and respected. He also left behind something he couldn't have predicted. He left behind a name that other men would attach to other companies, other products, other ambitions. A name that would grow so large it would reshape the map of Wisconsin itself. Edward Allis built a factory. The men who came after him would build a world. The men who came after him moved fast. In 1901, 12 years after Edward Allis died, his company merged with 3 other industrial firms, Fraser and Chalmers of Chicago, the Gates Iron Works, and the Dixon Manufacturing Company. The new entity was called Allis-Chalmers. It was not a gentle combination of equals. It was an aggressive consolidation designed to create a single company large enough to compete with the industrial giants that were swallowing American manufacturing at the turn of the century. The logic was simple. Alone, each company was regional. Together, they could bid on contracts that none of them could have handled independently. Mining equipment, cement machinery, steam turbines, electrical generators, flour milling systems. The new Allis-Chalmers was not a company that made one thing. It was a company that made almost everything heavy industry required, and it needed room. The old Milwaukee Works was too small. The company looked west of the city and found open land, flat, accessible, close enough to Milwaukee's labor pool, but far enough out to build at the scale they now needed. They began constructing a new manufacturing complex that would eventually sprawl across 160 acres. A plant so large that it had its own internal railroad system, its own fire department, its own power generation. Workers didn't walk across the property, they rode. The community that grew around the plant incorporated as a city in 1902. They called it West Allis. Think about what that means. The company didn't move into an existing town. The town formed around the company. West Allis existed because Allis-Chalmers existed. The streets, the houses, the schools, the churches, the taverns along Greenfield Avenue and National Avenue, all of it grew in response to the gravitational pull of one employer. Workers needed places to live. Their families needed stores and schools. The stores needed customers. The cycle fed itself. And within a generation, West Allis was a real city with a real identity, and that identity was inseparable from the plant. By the 1920s, the relationship between company and city had become something that is almost impossible to describe to anyone who hasn't lived in a true company town. Allis-Chalmers was not just the largest employer, it was the economic heartbeat of the entire community. The shift whistle at the plant set the rhythm of daily life. Traffic patterns revolved around shift changes, restaurants filled when shifts ended, taverns knew the schedule by memory. Entire families, fathers and sons, brothers and cousins, worked inside those 160 acres. You grew up hearing the plant. You smelled the foundry smoke. You knew people who worked there before you knew what they did. At its peak, roughly 15,000 people worked at the West Allis complex. 15,000. In a city whose total population at the time hovered around 50,000 to 70,000, that meant a staggering share of every household had someone connected to the plant. The company ran English language classes for immigrant workers. It operated a clubhouse. It sponsored athletic teams. It was not an employer in the modern sense, a place you drove to, worked at, and drove home from without thinking about it. It was the center of civic life, and the products coming out of those 160 acres were genuinely extraordinary. Allis-Chalmers built steam turbines that powered electrical generating stations. It built crushing and grinding equipment that processed ore in mines across the American West. It built pumping systems, cement manufacturing equipment, flour milling machinery. During the World Wars, it built military equipment, submarine engines, superchargers for aircraft. The company had contracts with the federal government for some of the most critical infrastructure projects of the 20th century. Allis-Chalmers equipment helped build the hydroelectric systems at major American dams. This was not a small company that made one product well. This was an industrial conglomerate that touched nearly every sector of heavy American industry. If something was big, heavy, and essential, there was a decent chance Allis-Chalmers had built part of it. But here is the thing that would define the company in the minds of ordinary Americans, the thing that would make the name Allis-Chalmers mean something to people who had never seen a steam turbine or a mining crusher, but people who had never visited Milwaukee or walked past the West Allis plant. Tractors. Allis-Chalmers entered the farm equipment business in 1914 when it acquired the gas traction business that became the foundation of its agricultural line. At first, it was one more product line inside a company that already made dozens of things. But farming was different from mining or power generation. Farming was personal. Farming was millions of individual families making individual purchasing decisions based on trust, familiarity, and loyalty. A turbine buyer was an engineer with a specification sheet. A tractor buyer was a man standing in a dealership with his son, looking at a machine that would determine whether his family ate well that year. And Allis-Chalmers understood that. Maybe not immediately, maybe not consciously at first. But over time, the company learned that its tractor line was different from everything else it made. Turbines built the company's balance sheet. Tractors built the company's identity. The color helped. Allis-Chalmers painted its tractors Persian orange, not red like Farmall, not green like John Deere, not yellow like Caterpillar. Orange. A color that stood out in a plowed field, that caught the light differently than anything else at a county fair, that became so identified with the brand that farmers stopped calling it Persian orange and just called it Allis-Chalmers orange. Children recognized the color before they could read the name on the hood. Farmers who had never owned one still knew what orange meant when they saw it parked along a fence row. Like, the color did something that no amount of engineering specifications could do. It made the brand visible, personal, and emotional. You didn't just buy an Allis-Chalmers, you declared yourself. You were an orange man, the same way your neighbor was a green man or a red man. It was identity, not just equipment. And in the 1930s, Allis-Chalmers did something with its tractors that changed farming itself. Rubber tires. It sounds simple now. Every tractor today runs on rubber, but in the early 1930s, farm tractors ran on steel wheels. Heavy, slow, brutal on roads, punishing on fields. Steel lugs tore up pavement. Farmers who needed to drive a tractor from one field to another along a public road were a menace to the surface and a hazard to traffic. The machines were loud, rough, and limited to about 3 or 4 miles per hour in any practical sense. Allis-Chalmers didn't invent the rubber tire, but it was the company that proved rubber tires belonged on a tractor. In 1932, Allis-Chalmers put aircraft-style pneumatic rubber tires on its Model U tractor and took it on a demonstration tour that included a famous publicity run where a tire-equipped tractor was driven at speeds that would have been unthinkable on steel wheels. The company promoted the idea aggressively, working with tire manufacturers to develop agricultural rubber that could handle field conditions, mud, stubble, rocks, uneven ground, without failing. The effect on farming was immediate and enormous. Rubber tires let tractors travel faster on roads. They reduced soil compaction in fields. They made the ride less punishing for the operator. They opened up the possibility of using a tractor for road transport, not just field work. A farmer with a rubber-tired tractor could drive to town. That changed what a tractor was. It was no longer just a field machine. It was transportation. It was daily life. Allis-Chalmers didn't just sell this as a feature, it sold it as a revolution, and it was right. Within a few years, every major tractor manufacturer was offering rubber tires. But Allis-Chalmers had been first to push it, first to prove it, and first to stake its reputation on it. The orange tractor became synonymous with the idea that farming equipment could be modern, fast, and comfortable, not just strong, smart. That reputation carried the company through the 1930s and into the post-war boom. While the Depression crushed other manufacturers, Allis-Chalmers kept its tractor line visible. The orange machines showed up at state fairs, at field demonstrations, at county dealerships across the Midwest and the South and the Great Plains. The company built a dealer network that reached into small towns where the Allis-Chalmers dealership was as much a community institution as the feed store or the grain elevator. And after the war, when American agriculture mechanized at a pace that would have been unimaginable a generation earlier, Allis-Chalmers was positioned to ride the wave. By the early 1950s, the company held roughly 10.3% of the U.S. wheel tractor market. That put it behind John Deere and International Harvester, but firmly in the conversation. 1 out of every 10 wheel tractors sold in America was orange. In certain regions, parts of Wisconsin, Minnesota, the Dakotas, the Upper South, the share was even higher. These were Allis-Chalmers territories, places where the orange machines were not the alternative choice, but the default. The product line was deep. Tractors, combines, planters, balers, forage harvesters. A farmer could run an entire operation on Allis-Chalmers equipment and never need to visit another dealer. The company wasn't just selling machines, it was selling a system, a relationship, a commitment that passed from father to son. There are families in the Midwest who ran Allis-Chalmers equipment for 3 generations. The brand loyalty was not rational in the way a purchasing manager would understand it. It was personal, it was inherited, and the innovations kept coming. In 1961, Allis-Chalmers introduced the D19, and the D19 had something no production farm tractor had ever offered from the factory: a turbocharger. Turbocharged engines were common in heavy trucks and industrial applications, but putting a factory-installed turbocharger on a farm tractor was a genuine first. The D19 gave farmers more horsepower from a smaller, lighter engine. It was efficient, it was powerful, and it was the kind of engineering achievement that made Allis-Chalmers engineers proud to work there. The company promoted it heavily. The D19 became a point of pride for the brand, proof that Allis-Chalmers was not just a follower in the tractor market, but a leader, a company that could innovate at the highest level of agricultural engineering. Orange wasn't just a color, it was a technology statement. By the mid-1960s, if you had stood on the roof of the West Allis plant and looked out across 160 acres of manufacturing capacity, foundries, machine shops, assembly lines, paint booths, testing areas, shipping docks, you would have seen a company that looked permanent. A company that employed thousands, supported a city, exported products around the world, and operated in so many sectors of heavy industry that no single market downturn could threaten it. Turbines, generators, mining equipment, construction equipment, farm equipment. Allis-Chalmers was diversified, established, and large, too large to fail. That was the feeling, not the phrase. Nobody used that phrase yet, but the assumption. A company this big, this embedded in the physical infrastructure of American industry, could not simply disappear. It had survived 2 world wars, the Depression, multiple recessions. It had survived technological shifts that killed competitors. It was Allis-Chalmers. It employed your father. It employed your neighbor. It was the reason your city had a name. But inside the company, behind the 160 acres and the orange paint and the engineering awards, something had already started to go wrong. And it had nothing to do with tractors. It started with electricity. In 1960, the federal government announced indictments in what became known as the Electrical Equipment Price-Fixing Conspiracy. 29 companies were accused of rigging bids and fixing prices on heavy electrical equipment, turbines, generators, switchgear, transformers, worth hundreds of millions of dollars in government and utility contracts. The conspiracy had been running for years. It was systematic, deliberate, and involved executives at the highest levels of the participating companies. General Electric and Westinghouse were the biggest names in the scandal, but Allis-Chalmers was in it too. The company's involvement was not incidental. Allis-Chalmers executives had participated in secret meetings at hotels and trade gatherings where competitors agreed to take turns submitting the lowest bid on government contracts. They divided up the market. They eliminated competition. They treated public infrastructure spending as a private cartel. When the indictments came down, several Allis-Chalmers executives were convicted. Some went to prison. The company paid fines and settled civil damages. The financial penalties were painful but survivable. The real damage was something harder to measure. The scandal told a story about what kind of company Allis-Chalmers had become. Not a scrappy ironworks built by a leather dealer with more nerve than experience. Not a company that won business by building the best equipment. A company that had grown large enough to believe it could fix the game rather than play it. A company where confidence had curdled into something uglier. The tractors still sold. The turbines still shipped. The plant still employed thousands. But something in the internal culture had cracked. The company that Edward Allis had built by outworking and outlasting his competitors had produced executives who thought they didn't need to compete at all. And the timing was terrible. Because the decades ahead would demand exactly the kind of competitive toughness that bid rigging had quietly replaced. The cracks spread slowly through the 1960s and into the 1970s. Not the kind of cracks that make headlines, the kind that show up in internal reports, in market share tables, in the faces of division managers who know something isn't working but can't get anyone above them to listen. Allis-Chalmers was still big, still diversified, still profitable in most years, but the company was starting to behave like a holding company rather than a manufacturer. Each division operated in its own world. Tractors over here, turbines over there, mining equipment in another building, construction machinery in another. The divisions competed for internal capital the way siblings compete for attention, and the winners were not always the divisions that deserved it. The tractor division needed investment. By the late 1960s, the competition had intensified dramatically. John Deere was spending heavily on new product development, building larger and more powerful machines, expanding its dealer network, and marketing with a sophistication that made Allis-Chalmers look slow. International Harvester was enormous. Case, Massey Ferguson, Ford. The field was crowded and every competitor was pushing harder. The days when a good product and a loyal dealer network could sustain market share without massive reinvestment were ending. Allis-Chalmers knew this. Engineers inside the company knew it. Dealers knew it. Farmers who had been loyal to Orange for years were starting to walk into John Deere dealerships because the green machines were newer, more powerful, and backed by a company that was visibly investing in the future of its product line. But the capital that should have gone into tractors kept getting pulled toward other priorities. The company was spread across too many industries, and every division had a claim on the corporate checkbook. Tractors were important to the brand's public identity, but turbines and generators were important to the balance sheet, and mining equipment had its own demands, and construction equipment needed attention too. The result was that no single division got the investment it needed to dominate its market. Allis-Chalmers was present everywhere and overwhelming nowhere. And then the company started doing something that looked rational on paper, but felt, to the people inside it, like the beginning of an autopsy performed on a living body. It started selling pieces of itself. In 1974, Allis-Chalmers entered a joint venture with Fiat to combine their construction equipment operations. The new entity was called Fiat Alice, and Fiat held a 65% majority stake. On paper, this was a strategic partnership. In practice, it meant Allis-Chalmers no longer controlled its own construction equipment business. The orange bulldozers and scrapers and loaders that had carried the Allis-Chalmers name on construction sites across America were now majority owned by an Italian conglomerate. Workers in West Allis understood what this meant, even if the press releases didn't say it plainly. A division that had been part of the family was now mostly someone else's property. The company was not growing, it was dividing. 4 years later, in 1978, Allis-Chalmers did it again. This time, it was the electrical power equipment business, the turbines, the generators, the switchgear, the products that had been at the heart of the company since the original merger in 1901. Allis-Chalmers formed a joint venture with Siemens, the German industrial giant, creating Siemens Allis. Once again, the partner held the controlling interest. Once again, a core part of what Allis-Chalmers had been was now operating under someone else's authority. 2 joint ventures in 4 years. Construction equipment gone, electrical equipment gone. What was left? Tractors, farm equipment, mining machinery, some smaller industrial lines. The company still had the West Allis plant, still had thousands of employees, still had the name on the building and the city on the map. But the structure was hollowing out. But each joint venture removed a load-bearing wall, and the building was starting to lean. The leadership was struggling too. David Scott, who had been running the company, gave way to Wendell Buecha in 1983. Buech inherited a company that was no longer really a conglomerate in any functional sense. It was a collection of remaining businesses, some profitable, some not, held together by a corporate name and a headquarters that remembered being bigger than it now was. In 1983, the company sold Simplicity, its outdoor power equipment line, the division that made lawn tractors and garden equipment. Simplicity was not a major revenue driver, but it was one more piece removed, one more product line that had carried the Allis-Chalmers name into people's garages and backyards, gone. Each sale, each joint venture, each divestiture had its own internal logic. Each one could be justified in a boardroom with charts and projections and strategic rationale. But the cumulative effect was something no chart could capture. The company was becoming less, not leaner, not more focused, less. Every time a division left, the remaining divisions had to carry more of the corporate overhead with less support, less diversification of risk, and less reason for talented people to believe the future was going to work. And through all of this, the joint ventures, the divestitures, the leadership changes, the farm equipment division kept building tractors, orange tractors, the engineers kept working, the assembly line kept running. The dealers kept selling, farmers kept buying, though the numbers were softening. The tractor division was the part of the company that ordinary Americans knew, the part that showed up in fields and at county fairs and in the memories of every kid who had ever ridden on a fender while their father plowed. It was also, by the early 1980s, the part that was most exposed to what was coming. Because the American farm economy was about to collapse. The story of the 1980s farm crisis is not complicated, but it is brutal. Through the 1970s, American agriculture had boomed, export markets expanded, commodity prices rose, land values climbed. The federal government encouraged farmers to plant fence row to fence row, and the financial system was happy to lend against rising land values. Farmers borrowed heavily to buy more land, to buy bigger equipment, to expand operations that seemed destined to keep growing. The numbers tell the story. Total U.S. farm debt went from roughly $60 billion in 1962 to $216 billion by 1983. That is not a gradual increase. That is an explosion of leverage built on the assumption that land prices and commodity prices would keep rising. They didn't. In 1979, the Federal Reserve began raising interest rates to break inflation. The prime rate hit 21.5% in 1981. Farmers who had borrowed at variable rates watched their interest payments double and triple. At the same time, President Carter imposed a grain embargo against the Soviet Union after the invasion of Afghanistan, and export markets that American farmers had been counting on shrank overnight. Commodity prices fell, land values, the collateral backing all that debt, started dropping. The math became impossible. A farmer who had borrowed against land worth $3,000 an acre to buy equipment and expand his operation was now sitting on land worth half that, paying interest at rates that would have been unimaginable 5 years earlier, selling grain at prices that didn't cover his costs. Foreclosures began. Banks that had lent aggressively to agriculture started failing. Entire communities built around farming, the implement dealers, the feed stores, the grain elevators, the small-town banks, began to buckle. And when farmers stop buying, the companies that build farm equipment feel it immediately. Allis-Chalmers had reached roughly $2 billion in annual sales in 1980. The company reported a profit of $47.6 million that year. Those were the peak numbers. They looked like strength. They were actually the last good breath before the fall. By 1982, the farm equipment industry was in free collapse. Farmers weren't buying tractors, they weren't buying combines, they weren't buying anything they could postpone. Dealers who had ordered inventory based on the boom years were sitting on lots full of unsold orange machines, making floor plan payments they couldn't sustain. Some dealers closed, others switched brands. The network that Allis-Chalmers had spent decades building, the personal relationships between dealers and farm families, the handshake loyalty that kept orange in the field, was dissolving under financial pressure that no amount of loyalty could withstand. Allis-Chalmers reported losses that year that mirrored the catastrophe across the entire industry. The company that had made $47.6 million in profit in 1980 was bleeding cash 2 years later. And unlike John Deere, which had deeper pockets and a larger market share to absorb the blow, or Case and International Harvester, which would merge their way toward survival, Allis-Chalmers had already hollowed itself out. The construction equipment was gone to Fiat. The electrical equipment was gone to Siemens. The company had fewer places to hide, fewer profitable divisions to subsidize the losses, fewer options. The layoffs started. In West Allis, the tractor assembly line went to reduced shifts. The foundry cut production. Nearly 900 workers were laid off in a single round from the tractor line and foundry operations. These were not distant numbers in a corporate filing. These were people who lived in the neighborhoods around the plant, whose mortgages depended on that paycheck, whose kids went to school with the kids of other Allis-Chalmers workers. When 900 people lose their jobs from one plant in a city of 60,000, everyone knows someone who got the notice. The taverns on National Avenue felt it. The diners that served the shift change crowds felt it. The car dealerships and the grocery stores and the little shops that depended on Allis-Chalmers paychecks circulating through the local economy. They all felt it. The plant whistle still blew, but it was calling fewer people, and some mornings the parking lots had gaps that hadn't been there before. Inside the company, the conversations had shifted from growth to survival. How do you keep a tractor company alive when the farmers who buy your tractors are going bankrupt? How do you invest in new products when your cash flow is negative? How do you hold a dealer network together when dealers are closing their doors? The answers were ugly. You cut costs, you reduce inventory, you close facilities, you ask the people who remain to do more with less, and you hope the cycle turns before the money runs out. But Allis-Chalmers was not just fighting the farm crisis, it was fighting the accumulated consequences of 20 years of strategic fragmentation. The company had sold its construction equipment, sold its electrical equipment, sold simplicity, and now the one division that was left with real emotional meaning, farm equipment was getting hammered by the worst agricultural downturn since the Depression. Wendell Buesch and the board faced a choice that was not really a choice. The farm equipment division needed massive investment to survive. New products, new technology, dealer support, marketing, at exactly the moment when the company had the least capacity to invest. The money wasn't there. The credit wasn't there. The diversified base that might have generated cash to sustain the tractor line through a cyclical downturn had been dismantled through a decade of joint ventures and divestitures. The company that had once been too large and too diversified to be threatened by any single market downturn had made itself small enough and concentrated enough that a single market downturn could kill it. And so the board made the decision that would end the story most Americans understood as Allis-Chalmers. In May 1985, the board of directors approved the sale of the agricultural equipment division to Kluckner Humboldt Deutz, the German engine and equipment manufacturer known as KHD. The deal included the tractor line, the combine line, the implement line, the dealer network, and the right to use the Allis-Chalmers name on farm equipment. KHD would rebrand the products under a new name, Deutz Allis, and eventually the Allis name would be dropped entirely when the business was later sold again and became AGCO. The press release described it as a strategic transaction, a repositioning, a way to focus the remaining company on its industrial businesses. In West Allis, people heard something different. They heard that the thing they thought the company was, the thing it was known for, the thing that had made ordinary Americans care about the name, had been sold to a German company most of them had never heard of. The sale closed, and the calendar moved toward December. Through the fall of 1985, the West Allis tractor line was running out its final production orders. Everyone in the plant knew the end was coming. It was not a secret, not a rumor, not something whispered in the parking lot. It was on the schedule. The last tractors had been ordered, the last parts had been allocated, and when those orders were filled, the line would stop, and it would not start again. There is a particular kind of grief that comes from watching something die on a schedule. A factory that burns down is a shock. A factory that closes without warning is an outrage. But a factory that gives you months to watch the end approach, that is something else. You show up every morning knowing the number of mornings left is shrinking. You build a tractor knowing it is one of the last tractors. You eat lunch with people you have worked beside for years, knowing that the thing that brought you together is about to end, and there is nothing any of you can do about it. Workers at the West Allis plant described those final months in terms that had nothing to do with business strategy or market conditions. They talked about the sound of the line, the smell of the paint shop, the weight of the parts in their hands, the things you stopped noticing after 15 or 20 years on the same job suddenly became vivid again, because they were almost gone. One worker told a reporter he kept looking at the tools on his bench and thinking about who would use them next. The answer, he realized, was nobody. Not here. Not for this. The final production run came down to the first week of December. Model 6070 tractors, painted orange, rolling through the same assembly sequence that had been producing Allis-Chalmers tractors for decades. Each one was a machine, and each one was also an ending. On December 6, 1985, the last one came through. The line stopped. Workers gathered. Some had brought cameras. The plant management marked the moment. This was not a tractor that would be shipped to a dealer and sold to a farmer without anyone noting what it represented. This was the last orange tractor that would ever be built in West Allis. The last one to carry the name that had been on farm equipment since before most of the workers in that room were born. A worker who had spent decades on the line was photographed standing next to it. His expression in the newspaper images is not dramatic. It is tired. The face of a man who has known this was coming and has had too much time to prepare for it and is now standing in the moment itself with nothing left to prepare for. The overhead conveyors stopped moving. The tools went quiet. The paint shop that had sprayed Persian orange on tens of thousands of machines would not spray it again. The specific smell of that paint, the chemical bite, the slight sweetness, the way it hung in the air on humid days, would fade from the building over the following weeks and months until it was just another empty industrial smell, indistinguishable from any other closed factory anywhere in America. Outside the plant, the December air in West Allis was cold. The parking lot was mostly empty. The shift whistle that had organized the daily life of the surrounding neighborhoods for generations had one less reason to blow. And here's the thing that made this loss different from the others. When Allis-Chalmers sold its construction equipment to Fiat, most Americans didn't notice. When it sold its electrical business to Siemens, most Americans didn't notice. Those were industrial transactions between corporations, invisible to anyone who wasn't reading the business page. But the tractors were different. The tractors were the part of Allis-Chalmers that lived in people's memories. The tractors were what you saw at the county fair when you were 8 years old. The tractors were what your grandfather drove, what your father cursed at when it wouldn't start on a cold morning, what sat in the barn with the orange paint fading and the seat cracked and the steering wheel worn smooth by hands you knew. When the tractors ended, the company lost something that balance sheets do not measure. It lost the reason anyone who wasn't a shareholder or an employee cared whether it existed. KHD took the product line and began selling the machines as Deutz Allis. The orange continued for a while under the new ownership. You could still buy an orange tractor technically, but it was not the same company behind it. The dealer network fractured. Some dealers stayed with the new brand, others left. The relationship that had been built over decades between Allis-Chalmers and the farming communities it served was not something that could be transferred in a contract. Farmers noticed. A Deutz Allis tractor might have been mechanically similar to the Allis-Chalmers machine it replaced, but the trust was different. The history was different. The feeling of walking into a dealership and knowing the company behind the nameplate, knowing its reputation, its responsiveness, its commitment to the agricultural community, that was gone. You cannot sell loyalty. You can only sell the assets. The loyalty belongs to the people who remember, and it stays with them. In West Allis, the empty tractor assembly building sat inside the larger plant complex like a stopped heart inside a body that was still technically alive. Other operations continued. And Allis-Chalmers still existed as a corporate entity, still had employees, still had remaining business lines. But the energy was gone. The identity was gone. The thing that had made the name mean something to people beyond the Milwaukee metro area was now owned by a company based in Cologne, Germany, and the connection between West Allis and the American farm was severed. The plant got quieter. Not all at once, piece by piece. A section closed here, a department relocated there. The 160 acres that had once hummed with the work of 15,000 people were slowly, steadily emptying. The company that had built a city was leaving the city behind. What remained of Allis-Chalmers after the tractor line ended was a company that most people would not have recognized. The name was the same. The headquarters was still in the Milwaukee area. There were still employees, still business operations, still a corporate structure with officers and a board of directors and quarterly reports. But the substance, the physical, industrial, productive substance that had made Allis-Chalmers one of the great American manufacturing names, was largely gone. The mining and mineral processing equipment was still there. Some smaller industrial product lines continued. But these were the bones of a company, not the body. The revenue was a fraction of what it had been. The workforce was a fraction. The physical footprint in West Allis was shrinking as buildings that had once contained foundries and machine shops and assembly lines sat idle or were leased to other tenants or simply locked and left. The company was trying to survive by becoming smaller, and there is a version of that strategy that works. A company that sheds unprofitable divisions to concentrate on a profitable core can emerge leaner and stronger. But that requires a profitable core, and Allis-Chalmers did not have one that was large enough to sustain a company of its overhead structure. The remaining businesses generated revenue, but not enough to service the debt, fund the operations, and maintain the infrastructure of a corporation that still carried the fixed costs of a much larger enterprise. The debt was the killer. Years of declining revenue, restructuring costs, joint venture complications, and the catastrophic losses from the farm crisis had left the balance sheet in ruins. Allis-Chalmers owed money it could not repay from operations. The asset sales, construction equipment, electrical equipment, farm equipment, simplicity, had generated cash, but that cash had been consumed by losses and obligations rather than invested in a sustainable future. By early 1987, the situation was terminal. The company could not meet its obligations. The remaining businesses could not generate enough cash to service the debt. The options had narrowed to one. On June 29, 1987, Allis-Chalmers filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The filing was not a surprise to anyone who had been paying attention. The company had been visibly struggling for years. The stock price had collapsed. The credit rating had been downgraded. Suppliers were nervous. Employees who remained were working for a company they knew was dying. The bankruptcy filing simply made official what everyone already understood. But there is a difference between knowing something is coming and seeing it arrive. For workers who had spent their careers at Allis-Chalmers, for retirees who drew pensions from the company, for the city of West Allis itself, the bankruptcy filing was a marker. Before this date, there was hope, however thin, however irrational, that something might change, that someone might find a way to save what was left. After this date, the only question was how long the unwinding would take. Chapter 11 is supposed to be reorganization, not liquidation. The legal theory is that a company enters bankruptcy protection, restructures its debts, sheds its unprofitable operations, and emerges as a viable business. Sometimes that happens. For Allis-Chalmers, the reorganization was really a managed dismantling. Either the remaining businesses were sold or wound down. The assets were distributed. The debts were settled at fractions of their face value. The process ground on through the courts in the way that bankruptcy proceedings do, slowly, procedurally, without drama, reducing a once great company to a series of legal filings and asset schedules. The human cost was not in the filings. It was in the neighborhoods around the plant. It was in the pension checks that people worried would stop coming. It was in the identity of a city that had grown up around a company that no longer functioned. West Allis did not collapse when Allis-Chalmers filed for bankruptcy. Cities are more resilient than companies. People found other jobs. Other businesses moved in. The local economy adapted in the way that local economies do when a major employer disappears. Painfully, unevenly, with some people landing on their feet and others never quite recovering. But something was lost that adaptation could not replace. The sense of purpose that comes from a city organized around a single great enterprise, the identity that comes from knowing what your city does and why it matters, that was gone. West Allis became a city that used to be something specific. A city with a name that referenced a company that no longer existed. A place where older residents could point to buildings and parking lots and empty lots and tell you what used to be there, and younger residents would nod politely without fully understanding what it meant. The retirees were the ones who carried it longest. Of men and women who had worked 30, 35, 40 years inside those 160 acres. They had started as young workers in a plant that felt permanent, and they had watched it hollow out, and they had collected their last paychecks and walked out into a world that no longer had a place for the skills they had spent their lives developing. They knew how to build turbines. They knew how to cast iron. They knew how to assemble a tractor from bare frame to finished machine. These were not abstract skills. They were physical knowledge held in hands and eyes and muscle memory, and when the plant closed, that knowledge had nowhere to go. They gathered at retiree lunches. They told stories. They remembered foremen and co-workers and machines, and the way the foundry smelled at 6 in the morning. They kept the memory alive because nobody else was going to do it. And the physical plant itself, the 160 acres that had once been the largest industrial complex in Wisconsin, was slowly, methodically being erased. Buildings came down, not all at once, over years. A foundry building demolished here, a machine shop cleared there. The internal railroad tracks that had once moved materials between buildings were pulled up. The infrastructure that had supported 15,000 workers, the roads, the utility lines, the fire station, the internal systems that had made the plant function like a small city within a city, was dismantled, piece by piece. Some buildings were repurposed. Light industrial tenants moved into spaces that had once housed heavy manufacturing. Warehouses replaced machine shops. Office space replaced engineering departments. The scale of the original operation was still visible in the size of the buildings and the width of the roads, but the purpose was gone. You could stand in a building that had once shaken with the noise of a drop forge and now held a distribution warehouse where the loudest sound was a forklift backing up. The company itself continued to exist in a legal sense through the bankruptcy proceedings and beyond, but its physical presence in West Allis shrank year by year. Offices closed, staff left. The corporate functions that had once occupied entire floors of buildings were reduced to smaller and smaller spaces as there was less and less company left to administer. In 1999, the last Allis-Chalmers office in the Milwaukee area closed. That sentence is easy to read and easy to skip past, but it deserves a moment. The last office. Not the last factory, not the last assembly line, not the last foundry. Those had been gone for years. The last office. The place where the final administrative functions of a company that had once employed 15,000 people in this city were carried out by a handful of remaining staff processing the paperwork of dissolution. When that office closed, there was no Allis-Chalmers presence left in the city that bore its name. No plaque went up, no ceremony was held. The closure of an administrative office does not generate the kind of grief that the last tractor did. It is a bureaucratic ending, not an emotional one. But it was the true ending. December 6th, 1985 was the day the identity died. June 29th, 1987 was the day the finances died. But 1999 was the day the company's physical connection to its home was severed completely. After that date, Allis-Chalmers and West Allis existed in the same sentence only as history. The land where the plant had stood was redeveloped over the following years. Retail spaces, industrial parks, housing, the kind of mixed-use development that fills the footprint of former industrial sites across the American Midwest. Practical, functional, economically necessary, and completely disconnected from what had been there before. A person walking through the redeveloped area today would have no reason to know what the ground beneath them had produced. No reason to know that the parking lot they crossed had once been a foundry floor where men poured molten iron. No reason to know that the retail store they entered occupied space where turbines had been assembled, where generators had been built, where orange tractors had rolled off a line and out into the American landscape. The erasure was not malicious. Nobody decided to erase Allis-Chalmers from West Allis. It happened the way these things always happen. Through economics, through time, through the simple need to use land for something that generates revenue today, rather than preserving it as a monument to something that generated revenue decades ago. Cities cannot afford to be museums of their own industrial past. They have to keep functioning. West Allis kept functioning. But the people who remembered did not stop remembering. Across the Midwest and beyond, in farm country and in factory towns, the Allis-Chalmers name survived in the way that beloved industrial names always survive, in the machines themselves. The tractors were still out there, thousands of them. Tens of thousands, sitting in barns, parked behind sheds, lined up at collectors' shows, restored and repainted and displayed at county fairs by people who had never worked for the company, but who felt a connection to it that was as real as anything in their lives. The orange paint endured, faded on working machines that farmers refused to scrap because the tractor still ran, and because getting rid of it felt like getting rid of something more than a machine. Bright and fresh on restored models where collectors had stripped the old paint down to bare metal and resprayed it in the exact shade of Persian orange, matching the color to original specifications with a precision that the factory paint shop would have respected. Allis-Chalmers collector clubs formed, swap meets, online forums, publications dedicated to the history, or the specifications, the serial numbers, the paint codes of machines that hadn't been manufactured in decades. The community that the company had once served now served the company's memory, preserving it with a devotion that the corporation itself had failed to sustain. At steam and gas engine shows across the Midwest, those weekend gatherings in county fairgrounds where old machinery is displayed and demonstrated, the orange machines always draw a crowd. An Allis-Chalmers WD-45 from the 1950s, restored to factory condition, will have people standing around it telling stories about their father's tractor, about the dealer in their town, about the summer they baled hay with a machine that color and the way the engine sounded at idle and the particular vibration of the steering wheel through their hands. These are not nostalgic fantasies. They are physical memories stored in the bodies of people who did real work with real machines. The weight of a tractor seat, the reach to the throttle, the sound of a cold engine turning over on a January morning. These things do not fade the way corporate histories fade. They persist because they were experienced, not read about. The collectors and the farmers who kept the machines running were preserving something the company's own leadership had failed to protect. Not the balance sheet, not the corporate structure, not the strategic positioning. They were preserving the relationship between a name and the people who had trusted it. That relationship had been real. It was not marketing. It was not brand strategy in the way a business school would teach it. It was the accumulated result of decades of a company showing up in the same communities, selling through the same dealers, building equipment that worked in the specific conditions of specific farms in specific parts of the country. A farmer in southern Minnesota who bought an Allis-Chalmers combine in 1972 was not making a brand choice. He was buying from the dealer his father had bought from, trusting a company that had been present in his county for longer than he had been alive. When that relationship was severed, not by the farmer, but by the company's decision to sell the division, the loss was felt as personal betrayal, even though no one had intended it as betrayal. The executives who approved the sale of the AG division to KHD were trying to save what remained of the company. They were making the least bad decision available to them in a situation where every option was painful. But to the farmer standing in his barnyard looking at an orange tractor that now belonged to a corporate lineage he didn't recognize, the reasons didn't matter much. What mattered was that the name on his tractor had been sold by people who didn't understand what it meant to people like him. This is the gap that runs through the entire Allis-Chalmers story. The gap between what the company was to the people who ran it and what it was to the people who used its products. To the executives and the board, Allis-Chalmers was a portfolio of industrial businesses that needed to be managed, optimized, restructured, and when necessary, sold. To the farmers and the workers and the families of West Allis, it was something closer to a covenant. You built the machines. We trusted the machines. You employed our people. We built our lives around your presence. That was the deal. The deal was broken not by one villain, but by a sequence of decisions made under increasing pressure by people who had fewer and fewer good options. The electrical price-fixing scandal damaged the company's integrity. The joint ventures with Fiat and Siemens stripped away core divisions. The failure to invest adequately in the tractor line during the critical years of the 1960s and 1970s left the farm equipment business vulnerable. The farm crisis delivered the blow that a healthier company might have absorbed, but a hollowed-out one could not. And the final sale of the Ag division to KHD was the logical conclusion of a process that had been underway for more than a decade. No single person destroyed Allis-Chalmers. That is what makes the story hard to tell and hard to accept. There was no cartoon villain, no single catastrophic decision, no moment where one person's greed or stupidity brought the whole thing down. There was instead a long, slow erosion of capability and coherence, driven by decisions that each made sense in isolation and collectively amounted to the disassembly of an American industrial institution. But if you press on the history, if you push past the structural explanations and the market forces and the macroeconomic context, you find something that does look like a choice. The choice to treat the company as a collection of sellable assets rather than as an integrated enterprise. The choice to prioritize short-term financial survival over long-term industrial identity. The choice, made repeatedly over 2 decades, to solve problems by subtraction rather than by commitment. Edward Allis had solved problems by addition. He bought a failed works and added his labor and his judgment and his stubbornness until it became something real. The men who ran the company in its final decades solved problems by subtraction. They sold the construction equipment, They sold the electrical equipment, they sold simplicity, they sold the tractors. Each subtraction was a solution to an immediate problem and a contribution to the ultimate one. The question the Allis-Chalmers story asks is not why companies fail. Companies fail for all kinds of reasons, and most of those reasons are boring. The question this story asks is what happens to the people and the places that organize their lives around a company's promise of permanence when that promise turns out to be conditional. West Allis organized itself around Allis-Chalmers for nearly a century. Families built 3 generations of working life around the plant. Farm communities across the Midwest built their equipment decisions, their dealer relationships, their mechanical knowledge, their daily working rhythms around orange machines. All of it rested on the assumption, never stated, never guaranteed, but deeply felt, that the company would continue to be what it had been. That the whistle would blow tomorrow, that the line would start, that the dealer would be there in the spring. The assumption was wrong, not because anyone lied. Because permanence is not something a corporation can promise, even when everything about it, the size, the history, the 160 acres, the 15,000 employees, the city that carries its name, suggests that it can. The name is still there. West Allis. You can drive through it today. The streets are paved and the houses are occupied, and the businesses along the main roads are open, and the city functions the way Midwestern cities function, practically without drama, with a quiet stubbornness that outlasts most of the things that happen to it. But the whistles are gone. The foundry smoke that used to hang in the morning air is gone. The sound of 15,000 people starting a shift, the footsteps, the voices, the clang of metal, the deep rumble of machines warming up, is gone. The orange paint that once stood out in fields from the Dakotas to Georgia, that children recognized before they could read, that farmers argued about the way people argue about things they love, is no longer being mixed in any paint shop in West Allis. The tractors are still out there, in barns where the light comes through the cracks in the siding and falls on faded orange hoods, in collectors' garages where restored machines sit on clean concrete with their paint perfect and their engines ready to turn over. At county fairs where old men stand in clusters around a WD-45 or a D-17 and talk about the farms they worked and the years they worked them and the machines that carried them through. The machines outlasted the company. The color outlasted the corporation. The memory outlasted the name on the building. In West Allis, where a factory once taught a city when to wake, the silence keeps its own time now.